In this video, I want to talk about utility. Utility means satisfaction, pleasure that you gain from consumption. This is the only chapter that we talk about consumers because on other chapters and in this class we're more focused on firms, businesses, how they behave. We are more focused on the production side of the economy. In this chapter, however, we'll learn how the consumers can maximize this utility, this satisfaction. If you remember budget line from chapter 1, you may remember that on the budget line we had different points. Each point was the combination of two goods that the consumers were able to afford with their limited budget. They could buy with their limited budget. However, we did not discuss there that which point at the end of the day the consumers will pick. We're going to get the answer in this chapter. So there are a few topics and concepts that you are going to read and you need to actually remember, like the definition of total utility, which is nothing but the total satisfaction from your consumption. Marginal utility. Marginal in general means additional, extra, and we have lots of marginal variables throughout the semester that you need to know their concepts and also know how to calculate them. So marginal means extra, additional. So the next concept is marginal utility, means the additional pleasure and satisfaction that you gain from using one more unit of output. You need to know how to calculate it, which is nothing but the change in total utility divided by change in quantity. You need to remember the formula. Also, pay attention to the graph we have, and I'm going to explain it a little bit. If you look at the lecture notes, right after where we define the law of diminishing marginal utility, which I will explain in a minute, there is this slide where you can see the total utility and marginal utility. So as you consume more and more, let's say tacos, as you eat more and more tacos, your total satisfaction will go up. Remember, when you are very, very hungry and you eat the very first taco, your total satisfaction goes up very fast. That's why at the beginning, the total utility is going up at a very fast or increasing rate. As you eat more and more tacos, since you're not as hungry as before, your total satisfaction is still going up, but slowly. So at some point, your total utility slows down. It is still going up, but very slowly. Then total utility reaches the maximum point, and after that point, if you eat more tacos, you are not going to get any pleasure, so your total utility starts to decline. Think about it. It's kind of funny, but think about it as a time that you are not hungry anymore, and if you want to eat another taco, you are going to throw up. So that is the place your total utility starts to decline. Now, let's look at the marginal utility. Marginal utility is your additional satisfaction. So your additional satisfaction from the very first taco that you eat is going to go down. At the beginning of your consumption, your marginal utility is the highest. That is the place where when you're eating the first taco. So the additional satisfaction that you're receiving from the time that you were not eating anything and you were super duper hungry. So your marginal utility is very high. But as you eat more and more tacos, the additional satisfaction that you are getting starts to decline. Pay attention to the relationship between total utility and marginal utility. Whenever your total utility is going up, your marginal utility is going down. When your total utility is maximum, your marginal utility is 0. And as soon as your total utility starts to decline, your marginal utility becomes negative. That is the throwing up part on the graph, okay? This decline in marginal utility as your consumption goes up is called law of diminishing marginal utility. These are the two important concepts, total utility and marginal utility, in this chapter. So make sure you understand them. Make sure you look at the graph and know the relationship between TU and MU. Another important topic in this chapter, which also leads us to answer the very first question that I raised, which point on the budget line we're gonna pick, is utility maximizing rule, or it's also called consumer equilibrium condition. It tells you when you as a consumer can maximize your satisfaction. There are tons of goods and services that we consume. If you know their marginal utility, and if you know the prices of all these goods and services, then you can figure out your consumer equilibrium, or you can maximize your utility. But remember, utility is a very touchy kind of subject. How you can measure your utility? Good question, right? Honestly, it's difficult to measure the utility. Okay, so economists have their ways, of course, of measuring that by ranking the goods and services, and they typically come up with the example with the numbers. So if you look at the example we have on the lecture notes or homework, you can see that there are some numbers, so just accept those numbers as calculated numbers. They are sometimes random, in our course, of course, but in the real world, as I said, the best way for economists to measure the utility is by ranking different goods and services. But definitely, you can be skeptical about the numbers that you see for total utility. If you don't like taco at all, your total utility is zero all the way. So it really doesn't make sense for you to even measure your marginal utility. Okay, so that is a very touchy subject. So I want you for this chapter to accept the numbers that you see, and just keep in mind that how the economists come up with those numbers. Back to the topic of utility maximizing rules. So if you know the marginal utility of the products that you consume, and if you know their prices, you are able actually to see where your utility is maximum. If the marginal utility per dollar, per price of all the goods and services that you consume are equal, are the same, you are a happy buyer, you are a happy consumer, and you can basically reach that maximum utility point that we're talking about. Mathematically, if you divide the marginal utility by price of all the goods and services that you consume, and if you equalize them, then you can maximize your utility. So which point you're gonna pick on your budget line? The point that gives you that consumer equilibrium condition, marginal utility divided by price of the two goods that you're going to consume, are the same at that point. Let's say you have good one and good two. If the marginal utility of good one divided by its price is equal to marginal utility of good two divided by its price, then that is the point that you pick on the budget line, and that is the point that gives you the maximum satisfaction, maximum utility. Remember the formula for consumer equilibrium condition. There's also one example on how you find basically that a specific point on the budget, like in which combination of two goods will give you the maximum utility. On the lecture notes, the example is the bottled water and chewing gum. You have the prices of $1 for the bottled water. You have the total utility. You should be able to calculate the marginal utility using the formula, changing TU, total utility, divided by changing quantity. Then in the next column, you are dividing the marginal utility by price of bottled water, which is just one. You're going to do the same thing for gum. And then whenever your last column in the bottled water and the last column of chewing gum, look for the equality between marginal utility per dollar of bottled water and marginal utility per dollar of chewing gum. Whenever these two are the same, that combination of bottled water and gum will give you the maximum satisfaction. In the example, that is the combination C, when you buy 2 bottled water and you buy 4 gum, because the marginal utility per dollar of bottled water is 12. The marginal utility per dollar of gum is also 12. So they are the same. So the best way for this consumer to maximize the utility is to pick point C on the budget line. Buys 2 bottled water and 4 packs of gum. You can also look at the homework to get to look at more examples kind of on the um, um, consumer equilibrium or the utility maximizing rule. This chapter is not that long, but remember the concepts that I mentioned. Pay attention to the graph and remember the formulas. Thank you.